The Kremlin has begun to fear that the war against Ukraine has reached a complete deadlock, and now the United States of America has officially announced that it has suspended its mediation efforts. And suddenly in Moscow they started talking again about the possibility of a diplomatic settlement of the war against Ukraine. The Russian side claims that the final outcome of the conflict may be based on a compromise, and that Russia is supposedly calling for such a compromise. And now sources from Western media claim that Putin is at a crossroads, to end the war or move toward a Stalinist model of dictatorship and mass casualties of war. My name is Alexei Pechi. Let's discuss this topic together. But before we start, I ask you to subscribe to this channel, like the video, leave any comment, and be sure to subscribe to my Telegram channel Pechi News. The link to it is in the description of this video.
Romka, make sure they hear it. 3 cheers, 3 times. 3. Hooray, hooray, hooray.
So after Vladimir Putin's trip to China to meet Xi Jinping, people in Moscow suddenly started talking about the possibility of a diplomatic settlement of the war against Ukraine. The Russian side claims that the final outcome of the conflict could supposedly be based on a compromise. At the same time, Russia continues to insist on the legitimacy of its own interests on the international stage. All of this was stated by the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Russian Federation, Sergei Lavrov, also known as Mad Horse. He stated that Moscow understands that the final settlement of the so-called, as they say, Ukrainian crisis will be the result of a compromise. According to him, this is allegedly evidenced by the position of the Russian leadership, which allows for both negotiations and the continuation of hostilities. Next, but I will quote Lavrov. President Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin recently, commenting on our negotiations with America regarding the Ukrainian crisis, said that we have a principled position, and we will achieve it either through negotiations or during the special military operation. But we understand that the final settlement will be the result of a compromise, just like any issue that in one way or another involves several states. But here is the problem for Vladimir Vladimirovich, the balding dictator. The negotiations are actually trilateral and they're all on pause. Today, Marco Rubio. Rubio, the US Secretary of State, directly stated that he says we don't see any point in continuing these negotiations between Russia and Ukraine with US mediation to end the war because they don't lead to anything. He says we're just going in circles, that's all. Why should we waste time on this? Then Lavrov repeated the claim that Russian interests on the international stage are legitimate and in accordance with the UN Charter. He stated that Moscow supposedly defends the principles of equality of states, non-interference in internal affairs and the protection of human rights, including linguistic and religious rights. Well, you know, when Russians, these wild, unwashed creatures, talk about defending the principle of non-interference in internal affairs, then why the hell did you go into Ukraine? What the hell did you get involved for, telling stories about Donbass, about the Revolution of Dignity, about Maidan, about what you called a coup d'etat? What the hell did you get involved for? You interfered in the internal affairs of another country. Who are you anyway? Just some kind of savages. That's why it's so funny and amusing when Lavrov, this mad horse, says, we are defending the principles of non-interference in internal affairs. So according to Lavrov, these are exactly the interests that Russia considers justified under international law. At the same time, he did not specify what form Russia thinks a possible compromise to end the war would take. But why such rhetoric all of a sudden? And Bloomberg reports today that the lack of success at the front, mounting losses, increasingly successful raids by Ukrainian drones, and the economic crisis, accompanied by constant internet shutdowns at the request of the security services, are forcing representatives of the Russian leadership to finally take a more sober look at the war they are waging. The nervousness that has begun to appear in society is shared by many members of the elite. The elites, including some high-ranking Kremlin officials, believe that the conflict has reached a dead end and there is no solution in sight. Vladimir Putin, according to one of Bloomberg's sources, intends to continue the war. Well, he's a bloody ghoul. What else can you expect? But he would like to end this war by the end of the year, though, as before, on his own terms, including gaining full control over Donbass. Putin would also like to reach a broader security agreement with Europe, which would effectively secure Moscow's territorial gains. What's interesting here is that Putin, as you've noticed for several weeks now, Putin and his entire entourage have been talking about wanting negotiations with Europe. They're suggesting Gerhard Schröder and Angela Merkel as mediators or representatives from Europe. But why? Because the Americans told them, go to hell, you uncivilized savages, go to hell, how can anyone negotiate with you? And Putin suddenly says, oh, we're ready to talk with the Europeans. Several European diplomats told Bloomberg that they consider the atmosphere in the Russian corridors of power to be grim. There is a stalemate on the battlefield, and Ukrainian drones are not only constantly disrupting the work of oil processing and exporting enterprises, but have also brought the war to Moscow. Let me remind you, on the night of May 17, almost 600 drones carried out the largest raid on the Moscow region since the beginning of the war, striking energy facilities and defense industry enterprises, and even Sheremetyevo airport. And now, out of sheer fear, literally trembling at the knees because of the drones, Vladimir Putin has completely stopped traveling to the regions, and he only appears in public in Moscow, the Moscow region, and St. Petersburg, which are the most heavily protected by air defense systems. The pause in his travels around the country, against the backdrop of increased strikes by the armed forces of Ukraine, has grown to 196 days, 196 days. Putin only comes out of his bunker in Moscow, St. Petersburg, and somewhere in the Moscow region. This didn't even happen during the COVID pandemic. Even when COVID was around, Putin used to appear in the regions more often. Now, for 196 days, he's basically pissing himself to go anywhere. At the same time, the Kremlin dictator hasn't curbed his ambitions and intends to seize Donbass, especially since the top military command convinced him that it could be done by autumn. Financial Times wrote about this. However, the advance of the Russian army hasn't just stalled. According to estimates from the US Department of Defense's intelligence agency, after Starlink satellite internet terminals were shut down for the Russian army in January, the Ukrainian armed forces liberated about 400 square kilometers. Ukrainian units are increasingly organizing counterattacks in which drones, including ground-based ones, are used together with infantry. So far, breakthroughs have not been achieved due to a significant shortage of personnel, but the army is no longer stuck in a purely defensive posture, as it did in 2025. Ukrainian Defense Minister Mikhailo Fedorov said this week that Ukraine has significantly slowed the enemy's advance and is gradually regaining the initiative. He is preparing reforms aimed at bringing more people into the army. In other words, it'll be mobilization in a different form. Although conscription, let's admit it, remains extremely unpopular in Ukraine, which is tired after what is now the 5th year of the full-scale phase of the war. It is planned to increase the salaries of servicemen primarily, yes, to replenish the infantry and to find other ways to attract recruits, as well as to improve the efficiency of troop deployment and expand the use of drones, including ground-based ones. And the most interesting thing is that even the most militant Russian military bloggers are no longer calling for mobilization. The thing is, they understand that it won't achieve anything. The armed forces of Ukraine are competing so fiercely. They control the front line with drones, so the mass arrival of troops would only mean new massive losses, not a breakthrough at the front. And now, the ubiquitous drones have made even the infiltration tactic ineffective, the one Russian soldiers have used since last year to slip through gaps in the Ukrainian defenses in small groups, usually pairs, while losing up to 90 out of every 100 soldiers sent forward. And against this backdrop, the Kremlin suddenly started talking about supposedly being ready to compromise. I'll leave it at that. Share your opinions and conclusions in the comments below this episode. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and don't forget to like. That's all for now. Take care of yourselves. Goodbye, everyone.